And then there is this idea, this constant narrative of victimhood, that actually it's not the children in Gaza, but it's the soldiers killing them who are the real victims here. And Israelis are really specialized in whatever you confront them with. It's not something they do to others. It's something that's done against them. They're always the victims. They slaughter a family. Well, think of the pain that those killing them are forced to endure, and so on. The Israelis during the first Intifada used to have this phrase, "shooting and crying." And
Wow.
and now it's more like perpetrating genocide and screaming.
Mouin Rabbani is a researcher, analyst, and commentator specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. He's the author of the upcoming book, Gaza Apocalypse. Mr. Rabbani, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
A year and a half ago, I interviewed Norman Finkelstein, who during our conversation said that we might still be at the beginning of this war. And in my completely naive self, I was kind of convinced that he must be wrong. Surely the Western world, with its, usual moral posturing, isn't simply going to stand by and watch this horrific mass slaughter of civilians for much longer. And yet here we are, 2 years later, with almost 70,000 people killed, the vast majority, of course, being women and children, with over 90% of homes in Gaza obliterated, mass starvation being imposed, and with every credible authority out there proclaiming that what's happening in Gaza is a clear case of genocide. But despite a daily dose of horrific atrocities being streamed via our phones, there has been no change whatsoever. The carnage goes on. Why?
Well, the moral posturing is exactly as you've described it, posturing, not morality. And there's long been a debate about why the West supports Israel. And I think we should start by taking Western leaders at their words. You may not agree with the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz when he says Israel is doing the dirty work for all of us. You may not agree with what other Western leaders say when they see Israel as a bulwark for Western interests in the Middle East and as a proxy for their interests, but that's how they see it. And ultimately, I think that's the most persuasive reason for their continuing support for Israel. A second feature of this relationship is that Israel is held to an entirely different standard than every other country in the world. I mean, no, African or Latin American or dictator or Asian autocrat would ever be given the type of blanket impunity that the genocidal apartheid regime of Israel enjoys. I mean, the West is now in the process of actively dismantling international legal institutions, the foundations of international law itself, for the purpose of preserving Israeli impunity. So I think you take these two factors together, where Western governments, of course, not all of them, because there have been significant changes during the past 2 years, but effectively Washington, London, and Brussels have essentially given Israel blanket impunity to do what it wants, because they view an Israeli failure as their own defeat and an Israeli success as a success for their interests in continuing their domination of the region.
Israel isn't the only ally of Western powers in the region. There's
Yes.
Qatar, there's Saudi Arabia. So what kind of interests are we really talking about here? And how can it be in the Western powers' interest to just have this wholesale slaughter of civilian populations? How does that
Well,
further
I
any
preface
interest?
yes, it's a very good question. I preface my previous response by saying, put aside for a second what you or I or anyone else may think about the logic of this relationship, and let's focus on what those engaged in this relationship believe. And I don't think they're making it up. I do believe that they're genuinely convinced that Israel is a very reliable proxy for promoting their interests in the Middle East and for their ability to continue dominating the Middle East. As you've said, the United States also has other partners in the region, has other client states, not only Israel. They have most of the Arab states. Turkey is a member of NATO, and so on. And those are seen as part of an alliance pattern. And what is important here is that many of the key states, like Egypt and Jordan, have peace treaties with Israel. Other states, such as the Emirates and Morocco, have normalized relations with Israel, and yet others, such as Qatar and a few others, have informal relations with Israel, while Saudi Arabia, the main one that doesn't have formal relations with Israel, not only already has a web of informal relations with Israel, but has made clear that it is prepared to normalize relations with Israel under the right conditions. So, perhaps this traditional way of looking at things, of one either has to support Israel or the Arabs, is entirely wrong. You can have an alliance with both the Arabs and, or at least most of the Arabs and Israel. The issue becomes the views of the Arab peoples, because we're talking here about, in Israel you have a genocidal apartheid regime that enjoys, at least for the fundaments of its policy, the overwhelming support of its own population. And in the Arab world, you have regimes that are basically viewed as fundamentally illegitimate, as not representing the will of their citizens, but they're sitting quite firmly in the saddle.
Israel says its aim is to eliminate Hamas, which is obviously just vague and impossible enough to keep the war going on indefinitely. What's Netanyahu's real aim in Gaza?
Well, I think there are multiple aims. Of course, he would very much like to eradicate Hamas. Of course, he would like to be able to retrieve all the remaining Israeli captives from the Gaza Strip. But fundamentally, I think he sees the crisis that erupted on October 7th as a historic opportunity to deal with the Gaza Strip once and for all. And just to go back into history, Gaza City is one of the world's most ancient cities, but the Gaza Strip didn't exist before 1948. If you would have said Gaza Strip in 1947, no one would have known what you were talking about. You wouldn't have been able to find it on any map. The Gaza Strip emerged as a result of the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, the mass dispossession and exile of Palestinians in 1948, and constitutes that minor part of the former Gaza district, which did not come under Israeli control. And as a result of the Nakba, the population of the Gaza Strip more than tripled from 80,000 to over 250,000. And from the very beginning, Israel was very uncomfortable with this reality of hundreds of thousands of destitute, embittered refugees living essentially within spitting distance of their former homes and determined to return to them. So from the early 1950s, Israel began making all kinds of proposals to achieve what it called thinning out the population of the Gaza Strip and its refugee population in particular. So there were all kinds of schemes to relocate Palestinians to the Sinai Peninsula, to Iraq, to Libya, to other places. And after 1967, it actually began to implement some of these schemes. One saw Palestinians being given incentives to leave with a one-way ticket to Paraguay in South America. Palestinians were exiled to Egypt, Sinai Peninsula, which was also under Israeli occupation at the time, to the West Bank. And a number of housing projects were started within the Gaza Strip, and the purpose of which was to reduce the population of its 8 refugee camps and move them out. Because from Israel's perspective, it was the refugee camps that were the most difficult nut to crack, that were the hotbed of Palestinian irredentism and insurgency. And this whole strategy, of course, fell apart in 1987 with the eruption of the First Intifada, when there was a general Palestinian uprising encompassing every town, every village, every refugee camp, every housing project from the northern West Bank to the southern Gaza Strip. After October 7th, and with the unconditional support of the West, certainly initially, Israel saw a historic opportunity to solve what it views as the Gaza Strip problem once and for all, essentially to make it uninhabitable for Palestinian life. And that's why you've seen not only assassinations of Hamas leaders and attempts to take out its military capacities, but the systematic destruction of infrastructure, of hospitals, of schools, of universities, and so on, the systematic destruction of housing stock, which, again, we're not talking about Berlin in 1945, where all these homes and apartment buildings are being shelled in the context of urban combat. We're talking about deliberate destruction by bulldozers, by explosives, at a time when there is neither combat nor even a threat of combat, conducted for the sole purpose of reducing the entire territory to rubble. And apparently, the level of destruction exceeds anything we've seen in many decades. And it's for this purpose that it's being conducted.
I listened to a lecture you gave recently during which you said Israel sees Hamas as a vehicle for Palestinian fragmentation. Could you elaborate this a bit further?
Well, so in 2005, as you know, well, it goes actually back farther. Hamas first emerged in 1988 and it emerged from the bosom of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood played an important role in resisting Zionism and then in fomenting elements of the Palestinian national movement during the 1940s and before 1967. After 1967, the Muslim Brotherhood adopted a strategy of passivity and of quiescence, in which its general strategy was one that they need to focus on essentially missionary work, if you will, the Islamization of Palestinian society as a prerequisite of conducting the struggle against Israel. And many people saw this basically as a pretext, as an excuse to not confront Israel. And this attitude by the Muslim Brotherhood was very appealing to the Israelis, because, of course, at the time you had a very vibrant Palestinian national movement composed of various nationalist and Marxist and other organizations, Fatah, the PFLP, the DFLP, the Communist Party, and so on, who, with the exception of the Communist Party before 1987, were all grouped under the umbrella of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. And there's quite a lot of evidence from the 70s and 80s where the Israelis were actively encouraging the Muslim Brotherhood, primarily as a tactic of divide and rule. So Muslim Brotherhood organizations could get permits because, in those days, permits was required for virtually everything aside from breathing. They had much more success acquiring permits from the Israeli military authorities than others. And then you had the Intifada that erupted in 1987. By that time, you already had an Islamist movement in Palestine named Islamic Jihad. And many of its members were, in fact, former Muslim Brotherhood members who no longer tolerated the Brotherhood's quiescence, and under the influence of the radical jihadist movements that emerged in Egypt and of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, began preaching and practicing a much more revolutionary form of Islamism. So, kind of the joint challenge of um, revolutionary Islamism on the one hand, of the Intifada on the other, and of the PLO factions on the other, put the Muslim Brotherhood in a very difficult situation. That if it didn't begin to actively participate in the Intifada, it would basically lose a lot of members to either Islamic Jihad or the nationalist movement or so on. And it was in this context that Hamas was established. It dates its establishment from December 1987. It proclaims that it was founded on the first day of the Intifada, on the 9th of December 1987. But in reality, it was founded in February of 1988. And during this period, where Hamas, in contrast to Islamic Jihad, did not join the unified national leadership of the uprising and operated kind of its own its own schedule of general strikes and its own communiques and so on. You saw Israel often encouraging Hamas, or putting Hamas slogans on walls in Christian towns and so on, again as a way of divide and rule. Now, by the early 90s, the situation had very much reversed, because Hamas was gaining in strength, was gaining in popularity, was emerging as Israel's most serious adversary in the occupied territories, and particularly in the Gaza Strip. And there you see Israel signing an agreement with the PLO, the Oslo agreements, in which the two parties had a joint interest in seeing Hamas weakened and cut down to size. Now, after the Second Intifada, Israel once again began to prioritize Palestinian division and fragmentation. Of course, it had never left, but it became a priority once more. So in 2005, you had the Israeli so-called disengagement from the Gaza Strip. And this was something that Israel refused to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority, in the full knowledge that in conducting the disengagement in the way they did, that it would only be a matter of time before Hamas would emerge as a dominant power in the Gaza Strip, while the Palestinian Authority would be the dominant power in those areas under its control, basically the cities in the West Bank. Now, there's no love lost between Israel and Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, particularly after Mahmoud Abbas replaced Yasser Arafat in 2004, was very keen to cooperate and collaborate with Israel. But nevertheless, from Israel's perspective, keeping the occupied territories divided, a political geographical schism between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, was more in line with its strategic objectives than unification of these territories under the leadership of a Palestinian Authority that was much more attuned to Israeli interests. Politics makes for strange bedfellows.
I suppose Hamas knew they're being sort of instrumentalized by Netanyahu to a certain degree. So why do you think they initiated the attack on October 7th?
I don't think Hamas's motivations on October 7th were significantly related to the issue we've just been discussing. Now, so having said that, in response to your question, the problem with giving a clear answer is that Hamas's own statements have not really put forward a clear strategic objective beyond conducting the attack itself. In my own view, Hamas on the 7th of October 2023 sought to irrevocably shatter the status quo, to ensure that the situation could not return to the unsustainable reality that existed not only in the Gaza Strip, not only in the occupied territories, but for the question of Palestine as a whole on October 6th. In other words, I think, you can look at it as something akin to the joint Egyptian-Syrian offensive on the 6th of October, 1973. They wanted to basically jolt the region and the international system into concluding that something has to change, and that Palestinian rights, the question of Palestine, can no longer be ignored, and that those who do ignore it do so at their peril.
Israel is going to be stained with these crimes, with genocide forever. Every single person I know is absolutely horrified at what they're doing. And it's not like we're just suddenly going to forget what happened at some point in the future. This is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, crimes of our times. And I'm saying that as somebody who was born in Yugoslavia, a story which didn't end very well. Now, I understand that the Israeli environment and its media landscape, it must be a bit of an echo chamber. I get that, but they are connected to the internet, and pretty much everyone over there speaks English. This isn't North Korea with like one state-sponsored channel and no other signal coming in. They know what the world thinks about this war. So do they just not care that the people outside of their borders, including most Americans who they rely on, are absolutely disgusted by their actions? I mean, how can a tiny, objectively insignificant country really afford this? I don't get it.
Well, there are multiple dimensions to that issue. First of all, I completely agree with you that Israel will never be able to outlive the Gaza genocide. It's kind of like, could you have the retention of the white minority regime in South Africa without apartheid? After Sharpeville, after Soweto, they became organically, intimately connected. And the only way to remove this stain was by removing the regime. Now, you were asking a question specifically, I think, about Israeli public opinion rather than about Israeli government policy. Well, this operates on multiple levels. I think one of the key issues that's often neglected is there's an organic relationship between international indulgence for Israel and Israeli impunity. So, at one level, many Israelis, from the moment they're born, they know that Israel can do whatever it wants, and there are never any consequences for what it does, least of all for what it does towards the Palestinians. I mean, for younger people, you have several previous onslaughts on the Gaza Strip, zero consequences. For somewhat older people, you had the Oslo Accords, where Israel was expanding settlements around the clock, zero consequences. The Second Intifada, and so on. So Israelis have by their Western sponsors and allies been conditioned to believe that they can do whatever they want and they will never be confronted with consequences. As I was saying earlier, the difference here is that Israel is held to an entirely different standard than any other Western proxy in any other part of the world. No one else would be able to get away with what Israel does. So that's I think, a fundamental part of it that people often overlook. The organic relationship between the impunity extended by the West and the ever more extreme policies of Israel, which, as you know, have now reached the level of genocide. A second one is this ingrained attitude among Israel's Jewish population, constantly fed to them by their leadership, that the whole world is against us. The world has always been anti-Semitic. Everyone hates the Jews, and therefore, no matter what we do, they're going to be against us. So we should just ignore what they think. Of course, if there was even a grain of truth to that, Israel wouldn't be receiving the total unconditional support of Washington, London, and Brussels, and for that matter, particularly Berlin, while it is perpetrating this genocide. So this whole kind of idea of, regardless of what we do, the world is going to be against us also helps kind of, how should I put it, insulate them from having to deal with reality. And then there is this idea, this constant narrative of victimhood, that actually it's not the children in Gaza, but it's the soldiers killing them who are the real victims here. And Israelis are really specialized in whatever you confront them with, it's not something they do to others. It's something that's done against them. They're always the victims. They slaughter a family. Well, think of the pain that those killing them are forced to endure, and so on. The Israelis during the first Intifada used to have this phrase, "shooting and crying." And
Wow.
and now it's more like perpetrating genocide and screaming. So they have these kind of psychological self-defense mechanisms, but I think you touched on a key point, is that some people have liked to suggest, well, the problem with Israeli public opinion is it lives inside a bubble and an echo chamber, and hasn't properly been exposed to the reality of what their government and what their military is doing, whether in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, or anyone else. That's total nonsense, as you rightly point out. Every Israeli has an internet connection. You don't even need to speak English to be able to understand the images. They either see these images and respond to them with approval, or they prefer to go to commentators and so on that explain to them why this is a good and just and righteous thing.
Yeah, just before the interview, I checked some of the comments in the main Israeli news sites like Jerusalem Post and Israeli Times. And the most liked comments on the top were always somebody saying, "Oh, we're losing the propaganda war." It's not about the conduct in the war. It's about losing some sort of
Yeah,
propaganda.
because the message is fundamentally correct. We just need to disseminate it in a more
Yeah.
professional way. Yeah.
By the way, we've already talked about the moral impotence of the West during this crisis, but why are the Arab countries in the region being so sort of comatose? Why are they tolerating Israel's rampage, not only in Palestine, but also in Syria, in Lebanon, in Qatar? I mean, some of these states are not just regional powers, they're also staunch allies of the US, like you've already
Yeah,
said. So I'm sure they could exert some pressure in Washington, right? And yet, despite all of that, they seem to be content to issue like a sternly worded statement here or there.
yes, no, that's a fundamental key issue in understanding this genocide. We've spoken about the unconditional support extended to Israel by the West. The flip side of that coin is the limitless tolerance that has been shown to Israel by Arab governments. And I think there are multiple reasons for this. One is their very close relations with the United States. They're basically U.S. client states. Many believe that they depend on Washington for their security and even their very survival. There is a whole web of relationships now that tie them to Israel directly or indirectly. And so they feel unable to confront Israel essentially without hurting themselves. But then there are a number of other factors as well. Um, Many of them initially saw this as a conflict between Israel and Hamas, just as they saw Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 2006 as a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. And in that context, we're quite pleased to see Israel administer a drubbing to Hamas. And an additional factor is, of course, Arab public opinion views the situation radically differently than do their leaders. And in previous instances, we have seen Arab leaderships express more tolerance, at least for the expression of pro Palestinian sentiment. by their own population. But I think the past decade of upheaval, what's often termed the Arab Spring, although I don't like that term, has fundamentally changed things from the view of Arab leaders. They've seen a number of their peers literally overthrown by massive street demonstrations. Um, and they feel that what they need to do is repress any popular protest from the moment it emerges, to nip it in the bud, lest it expand into something that goes beyond just expressing solidarity with people in a different territory and turns against the leaders themselves. So those, I think, are important factors in understanding the reaction of Arab leaderships. Now, the other question, of course, is, well, okay, that's the leaders; these are autocratic states, and so on. But why haven't the Arab publics become done more? And there, I think it's a more difficult question to answer. Many of them have, if you look, for example, at Libya, at Syria, and so on, many of them are emerging from years of brutal and violent conflict that has caused mass death and destruction. But then you look at Yemen, which has probably suffered more than any other Arab territory and people, and they're, in Yemen, really the only people who continue to actively mobilize and act on behalf of the Palestinian people. Having said that, all of that, I do think we are beginning to see a change of some sort, and I think the key turning point was, first of all, the Israeli-U.S. attack on Iran, and particularly more recently, the Israeli bombing of Doha. Initially, or all along, Arab governments have been quite content to play the role of inert spectator while Israel slaughters Palestinians within their homeland. It's something happening behind borders and so on. And, they may not have liked it. They weren't going to do anything about it. And particularly under Biden, while I accept your point that Arab leaders do have significant leverage in Washington if they choose to mobilize it, I think that leverage is significantly greater under Trump than it was under Biden. I mean, Biden was an ideological fanatic who was completely devoted to Israel. Trump couldn't care less for Israelis, Palestinians, Arabs, or anyone else, and has a much narrower perspective and acts primarily out of self-interest at the end of the day. But the point I wanted to make is, when Trump, in February of this year, first put forward his Gaza Riviera plan, the mass expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, the U.S. takeover of beachfront property, building Hotel Kushner, and so on, that sent the fear of death into the Arab government, because if this had happened, it would have formed a direct threat to Arab national security, just as the expulsion of Palestinians in 1948 and them subsequently taking up arms against Israel from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon, created conflict on the territories of those states. They understood the exact same thing was going to happen. They also viewed the implementation of this plan as putting a dagger in the heart of what remains of their legitimacy, and therefore creating problems for their domestic security and stability. And if you saw at the time, they very publicly and very vocally and very categorically rejected this plan. Usually we think of these leaders as kind of cowards who dare not confront or contradict Trump in public. Well, that's true. When it came to their core interests, they're not going to commit political suicide in the service of Jared Kushner's bank balance. So we saw that. And then when Israel attacked Iran. There's no love lost between the conservative Arab monarchies and Iran. But during the first Trump administration, when Iran attacked the Aramco oil facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia, and when the Houthis were sending drones and missiles into Saudi Arabia, even the United Arab Emirates, the United States did nothing to protect them. Whether it was unable, unwilling, or both is a different matter, but it didn't defend them. And what we saw as a result during the Biden years, these governments began normalizing relations, not with Israel, but with Iran. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, even normalized relations with Iran as a result of Chinese mediation. And then after October 2023, they increasingly began to see Israel less as a valued security and economic partner and more as a regional arsonist, pyromaniac running around the region, setting the entire region ablaze. And the attack on Doha, the Israeli bombing of Doha, in which they unsuccessfully sought to assassinate the Hamas leadership, which had been called to a meeting to discuss a proposal for a ceasefire that had been put forward by the Americans, that sent shockwaves through the region because it was very clearly understood this could only have happened with a U.S. green light. So you effectively had the strategic ally of these states authorizing another ally to bomb their own territory. Well, the deal they have with the U.S. is not that the U.S. will defend them from Iran. It is that it will defend them from foreign aggression, including Israel. And in the case of Israel, again, held to an entirely different standard than any other state, Israel is given a green light by Washington to bomb U.S. client states in the Middle East. And it's in that broad context, I think, that we need to see the developments of the past week.
Let's turn our attention to Donald Trump for a second. Throughout this war, there's been consistent reports of his supposed screaming matches with Netanyahu. And I've also read that apparently Trump was upset when he was being shown pictures of kids starving in Gaza. And yet Israel keeps defying and embarrassing him on every turn, like you mentioned, with its recent strike on Qatar, its ally, which apparently they did without even notifying the U.S.
That's impossible.
For somebody... Okay. So
sorry if I can interrupt you.
No, please. No, go ahead.
The largest U.S. airbase in the Middle East, if not outside,
is in Qatar. Yeah,
is in Qatar, in Udeid, and it's on constant high alert for the possibility of an attack emanating from Iran, coming from across the Persian Gulf. And the idea that they somehow had all their radars turned off and had no idea, if the U.S. had not authorized this, Israeli planes would have been shot out of the sky like pigeons. There is no way that the U.S. did not know about this, and as a result, did not mistake them for hostile forces and allow them to proceed. And any American official who tells you otherwise is lying through their teeth. It's entirely possible, given the chaos of the current administration. I wouldn't categorically exclude the possibility that Hegseth and Rubio and who else authorized Israel to do so without fully informing Trump, or even that together with Israel, they managed to convince Trump that this would change the equation in the Middle East. But the idea that U.S. forces in the Middle East did not know about this and also did nothing against it it defies imagination.
Okay, fair point. However, this dynamic between Trump and Netanyahu is strange, especially in the eyes of the general public, which is important to Trump. For somebody as thin-skinned and petty as Trump, this forgiving stance is extremely unusual, to put it lightly. Furthermore, we all know how much the man wants to be praised for his so-called peace efforts all the time, which makes this entanglement somewhat illogical. Now, Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone has said that his sources close to the White House claim that Trump is absolutely terrified of Netanyahu in Israel, which would explain a lot. Do you find this explanation plausible?
I'm not going to try to understand Trump's psychology. I think that is beyond the capacity of even the most dedicated psychological specialist. Um, but I would remind you that during the Biden years, we also had this pantomime of Biden being outraged by Netanyahu, yelling and screaming at him, and then doing nothing. So part of it is pure performance and political theater, meant to mollify opponents of Israeli policy. I
Right,
think
but
the
you sorry to interrupt, but
please,
you did say that Biden was an Israeli was a pro-Israeli fanatic, which you also said Trump isn't.
yes,
Um, yeah,
yes. But I was making the point about how seriously we should take reports of the great white father in the White House being very upset with the errant son in Tel Aviv and calling him to admonish him. We will know it's serious when we see change. Let me put it that way. I think the more pertinent issue here is that Trump, okay, this government is a personality cult, and Trump sits at its apex. That's all true. But it's also a coalition. It's a coalition that includes neocons, Christian evangelicals, business elites and billionaires, but also a sizable constituency of non interventionists, people who signed on to the MAGA movement in significant part because Trump promised them no more foreign wars, no more forever wars in the Middle East. And not only that, that he would be, like Jesus, the great peacemaker. And of course, he has achieved none of that since assuming office, except, of course, the peace treaty between Cambodia and Armenia that he that he bragged about. But that notwithstanding, I think that for this element of his constituency, yes, they're now increasingly speaking out about Palestine and Gaza and so on. But the key turning point for them, in my view, was Iran, because it was in Iran that you began to see direct U.S. military involvement in the Middle East, in the sense of U.S. planes overflying territory and dropping bombs and so on. And for many of these people, they have this theory that this is not an issue of the U.S. using Israel as a proxy, but rather that Israel has manipulated the United States into fighting Israel's wars in the Middle East. And that's why you're now seeing this growing debate about Israel, which would have been inconceivable previously, even within the MAGA movement. I mean, you look at some of these. You look at some of these characters like Tucker Carlson and so on. They've never uttered a critical word about Israel until recently, and it's because from their point of view, MAGA is America first, not Israel first. So I'm trying to remember what your question was, so I can actually answer it.
yeah. No, I was asking if like Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone reported that
Yeah.
Trump is actually kind of scared of
Yeah.
Netanyahu, of Mossad, and so
Yeah.
forth.
Yes.
There's a lot of
So
rumors about this.
yeah, I'm not in a position to answer that question. My sense is that Trump is also a white supremacist. Israel is viewed as part of the West, and Trump's instincts are pro-Israeli. Again, not an ideologue in the sense that Biden was, and so on. But Trump is also, U.S. foreign policy is auctioned to the highest bidder. That's why you saw, for example, when Trump went to the Gulf on his victory tour a few months ago, and the states he visited announced, I think, 75 trillion billion whatever investments in the U.S. The key thing they wanted from him was for the U.S. to lift its sanctions on Syria, and they got that. Now, why has Trump, flip-flopped on Israel? Is it possible that they have something on him and so on? I'm not going to categorically exclude that. Um, I don't know, but from what I've seen of this man, he tends to be easily susceptible to the last conversation he's had. I think he has been repeatedly promised by the Israelis of, one more push and it's over. If you only support us with this, it'll be finished. And then you can bask in our glory and so on. And I think with someone, as venal, as vain, as narcissistic, as stupefyingly ignorant as Trump, it has worked time and again.
In the last couple of weeks, a bunch of countries have recognized the Palestinian state, including the UK, France, Canada, and Australia. Is that just a meaningless diplomatic gesture, or do you think it carries any actual weight? Because it doesn't seem to be giving the Israelis any pause.
Well, I think for those governments, it was intended as a meaningless diplomatic gesture. But it may well turn out to be different. Now, a lot of people have said this is a game changer. A lot of people have said this is meaningless political theater. I disagree with both, and I'll tell you why. This isn't the first time that Western governments have taken decisions that Israel doesn't like. The difference is, in the past, they have done so in order to strengthen relations with Arab states, out of exasperation with Israeli policy, or other reasons, commercial interests, whatever. This is really the first time since the Zionist movement emerged in the late 19th century that Western governments have taken a position in support of Palestinian rights, primarily because of pressure from their own citizens. And that, I think, is a game changer, because it demonstrates to these people that all their campaigning, all their activism, all their speaking out, all their organizing is producing results. And the key question now is, what are they going to do next? Is the dam going to burst? Well, if you look at the phenomenal response in Europe to Israel's abduction of these hundreds of activists on the Solidarity Flotilla, things are changing. Things are changing rapidly. Things are changing in a way that, frankly, I never expected to see in my lifetime. It's really incredible, especially in Europe, where if you go back 20, 30, 40 years, the governments were actually ahead of their people in terms of their positions on these issues. Now it's the exact opposite, and it's a historic and as we were discussing earlier, I think, irreversible sea change. The big question, of course, is will it achieve results in time to save what urgently needs to be saved? But so again, the test of these recognitions is, will governments be able to use this as camouflage to kind of keep people satisfied and continue with business as usual, which will ensure there never is an end to the occupation or the two-state settlement they claim to support? Or is this like holding out red meat and is going to lead to even more activism that will force these governments to take concrete measures? And in that, if that happens, I think it will be seen as a significant, as a significant issue.
By the way, this just in, but apparently Hamas said today that they are ready to negotiate a ceasefire based on Trump's so-called 21, I believe, point.
Yes, and did you see Trump's response?
I think he said that. Sorry, if I'm correct, he said that Israel should stop any sort of military engagement in Gaza. Is that what it was?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, should I give the background to what's
Please.
happened?
Yes.
Okay. So we were discussing earlier the Arab states and so on, and their increasing apprehension about where the region is headed. And as you know, last week on the sidelines of the General Assembly, Trump conducted a meeting with a number of Arab leaders and leaders of Muslim states, Turkey, Pakistan, Indonesia, and I think a few others. And at this meeting, they basically told him, this needs to end. It's causing problems for us domestically. It's causing instability and so on. And they worked out a 21-point plan. And it was a plan that I think Hamas would not have had difficulty accepting, particularly if it came under the unified pressure of all these governments on the one hand, and pressure from within its domestic constituency, who were understandably desperate for anything to end this genocide. Then the good ship Netanyahu sails to the United States. Netanyahu meets with Trump, meets with Witkoff and Kushner and so on. And the plan is substantially revised. It's now a 20-point plan. Any reference to the West Bank is removed. It calls for disarmament, all kinds of things that Hamas cannot accept without committing suicide. And that Trump then announced the Netanyahu version of the plan. And if you would have listened to the press conference, the Netanyahu-Trump press conference, at which this proposal was announced, you would have been very challenged, if you didn't know better, to identify which of the two was the Israeli and which of the is the American, because they spoke in exactly the same language, making exactly the same points. And I think Netanyahu's objective was to craft a proposal that Hamas could not accept, and its rejection would then basically serve as a justification or as a pretext by Israel to continue and even intensify the genocide while maintaining full and unconditional U.S. and more broadly Western support. So Hamas was faced with this proposal that it could neither accept nor reject. It couldn't accept it because it couldn't be accepted without basically committing organizational and political suicide. And it couldn't reject it because if it did so, it would be doing so against the unified position of the Arab and Muslim leaders. And it would be seen to be callously disregarding the desperation of its own constituents who understandably, even if they were very cynical about this agreement, were saying, well, even if it's only a temporary pause, that's better than nothing. So the problem for Hamas was that when Netanyahu was allowed by Trump to rewrite this agreement, the Arabs, who were supposedly, speaking of getting very angry, were supposedly furious about this, didn't publicly reject it, and so left Hamas holding the bag of it being the one who needed to take the decision. So its response today was I thought, very interesting. It focused on the issues that mattered most to Trump. It said it accepted that element of the proposal that called for a comprehensive release of all the captives and corpses it holds, and for an end to the war. And then, playing to Trump's narcissistic vanity, it also thanked him personally for having issued this proposal. And then it said, as far as the other elements are concerned, those need to be negotiated and clarified. And there are other elements that are not within Hamas's competence to judge because they need to be governed by either a Palestinian national consensus or international law. And for good measure, even though Trump was demanding an answer by Sunday, they provided their response during the Jewish Sabbath to make it more difficult for the Israelis to come out with an immediate propaganda campaign. So they gave this response. It basically, did everything but nominate Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize, to appeal to his vanity. And then you saw this contest by Israel on the one hand saying, Hamas has rejected the agreement, which is, of course, what they dearly wanted. And the Arab and Islamic leaders saying, no, Hamas has provided enough of a basis to continue negotiations on clarification so that we have a proper agreement. And Trump, perhaps in part because he's failed in Ukraine, he's now experiencing a domestic crisis with the government shutdown, and he's a master of diversion and deflection, first posted the Hamas response on his social media, and then posted a statement of his own saying that Hamas has accepted the agreement and that he's ordering Israel to immediately halt its bombings of the Gaza Strip, and that now we have a path towards lasting peace, not only in Gaza, but in the Middle East and, in fact, the entire universe. Typical Trump. Now, I'm old and wise enough to know that you take anything this man says with a grain of salt, and you don't take anything he says seriously until you see actual concrete results on the ground. And even then, you have to bear in mind they can be reversed at any point. I mean, we saw this with the Iran nuclear negotiations. But so now the question becomes, I think Hamas quite intelligently extracted itself from a real dilemma. It was between a very large rock and a very hard place, because it was an agreement it could neither accept nor reject. It was under tremendous pressure, and it has now, at least temporarily, managed to shift the burden to Israel. It's now Israel's move. Will Israel defy Trump? They're certainly still bombing Gaza. But if Israel continues to defy its American master, will Trump, as in the past, go along with it? Or will he actually, do something about it? And that's a question that's going to be answered in the coming hours and days.
Last question. How do you think this really ends, and what happens to Palestinian people, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank as well? Like we said, on one hand, there's rising opposition in the West against what Israel is doing, but on the other, this regime is as genocidal as ever.
Well, I mean, does it end in the sense that, okay, we may see the guns largely fall silent in the Gaza Strip, but if we get a Lebanese-style ceasefire where, the other side has to scrupulously observe it, and Israel is free to violate it at will, if we see the continuation of settlement expansion in the West Bank, if we see continued Israeli bombings of Lebanon, of Syria, of Yemen, potentially again of Iran, as many people are expecting, and so on, has it ended? Or are we just, experiencing a constant crisis that is not genocide, but that is being caused by a regime that has made war its profession, that can no longer exist without constant conflict and the expansion of conflict. And ultimately, that's the question we have to answer. Will impunity make way for accountability? Will this unprecedented determination across the globe to hold Israel to the same standard as every other country on earth bear results or not? And once those questions are answered, then I'll have an answer for you.
Thank you so much. I hope we get to do this again in much better times once this nightmare is over. By the way, when does the book come out?
It'll be out early next year.
All right, perfect. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. You can also apparently hype videos there now. I would appreciate that. Also rate on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Marketing tutorials always insist I have to hassle you about that, so I'm doing it, even though I kind of hate it. Also, if you'd like to, please support me on Patreon. Big help. This is a one-person podcast. I do everything by my little old self. There's no team behind me. Not even one person. Very, very sad. Playing the world's smallest violin. I know, but you can help by hopping on Patreon and finding the Smart Cookies podcast on there and become my producer, one of my producers. Speaking of which, last but certainly not least, I have to thank my existing patrons. Without you, there would be no Smart Cookies, as I always say, which makes you actual producers of this show. So eternal gratitude and thanks go to Richard, Amy Ons, Mattia Renchel, Florian Hauer, Peter Karba, Matija Zupancic, Dejan Žulnir, Darej, Rok Tržan, Saša Vipotnik, Neven Cvijanović, Juž Premrov, Sirkezi, Goran Ivašić, Anže Sever, Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaž Mahar, Štrole, Ajda Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Goran, Gordan, Lorenzo, Juričuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Tai Chi. I started smiling there in the middle because the list is growing, which makes me super happy. So thanks again. Ciao, ciao.